part of the way in which this program knits itself together is some of the deep background structure. And one could call that strategic structure as opposed to tactical structure. The tactical structure is that we're using pairs of books to give us a sense of momentum. In other words, without some kind of way of counting steps, because of the amorphous nature initially of a lot of this material, and because of the ambidextrous response to the amorphous material, it's very difficult when you first begin to tell whether anything is happening. And especially so because I have to play devil's advocate because of educational theory. And the educational theory that I work with believes that you have to start from confusion. The teacher should confuse the student first. Because if you are left in possession of your belief and conviction that you know something, there's no way that you can learn something new, especially something completely new. And so the only way to wake up to the fact that you've got to figure out what's going on, and that opens you to something new, is to feel confusion. And so I try to overload. I produce confusion through love, through overloading, through choosing such disparate examples and bringing them together in such folded forms that none of you would be familiar enough with this range of material and the complexity of the folded forms. In math, they're called supermanifolds. It's intensely chaotic for someone coming in fresh out of an ordinary life. And all that is to produce this kind of fruitful learning situation where you have to start wondering yourself what's going on. And the best kind of question to ask for the first 3 or 4 months in this course is, what are we doing? Okay, we've done this, we've done that, we think we did this, we think it means that, but today, what are we doing? And so if we ask that question today, right now, well, what is he talking about? What are you doing? You're listening to me. What am I doing? I'm speaking to you. Well, what does that amount to? It amounts to a communication of your receptivity and my creativity. So you could say, using a kind of a Chinese motif that we began with, one of our first books was the I Ching. You remember that? And the paired book with it was Thoreau. We began with Thoreau and the I Ching. And the I Ching, stylized in an ancient classic Chinese way, that there is a yin-yang polarity that inhabits structure. And the yang is the creative aspect, the yin is the receptive. So if I move my hand through the air is receptive to my hand. Not only the air, but the space around my hand is receptive, so the hand is yang. But I can, by holding the hand in a certain way, make the hand yin and the space around yang. So that if I shape my hand like that, initially this is a symbolic form. It means okay. It also, in ancient Buddhism, meant okay, but it meant it in a transcendental way. It's the same thing. If I hold my hand like that, initially, the mudra form of the hand is creative, but the longer I hold it, the more that this hand recedes from a yang phase to a yin phase. So that if I were holding this hand like this and the hand were conscious, it would move from this to this. And this particular mudra is total yin. It's total receptivity. So if you hold the hand so it's perfectly straight like this, it is a yin form, not a yang form, not creative, but a receptive form. With one little tiny modulation, I can change it to a yang form. All I have to do is move the middle finger forward about 1/8 of an inch. And by thrusting the middle finger forward, it changes this from a yin form to a yang form. How so? When the hand is perfectly straight, it's like peaceful. It's a universal sign of peace, of calmness, of equanimity. By pushing the middle finger forward just a little bit, it changes that from peace to teaching. That's the way that one would read that mudra. Yin and yang, creative and receptive, so that forms can be creative and receptive. Spaces can be creative and receptive. So that to just simply identify something, oh well, form is yang and space is yin, would be a simplistic mistake. It would be a flaw. The creative and the receptive form a very special relationship with each other. It's called complementarity. And complementarity reads as a principle in the following fashion. Complements may exchange places and still function in the same wholeness. Complements may exchange places, that is to say, they can exchange physical places, they can exchange functional places, and the same wholeness will result. It's in the Midwest United States, in places like Indiana, they used to have a saying that meant exactly this. The saying was 6 of one, half a dozen of another. It's the same thing. The 6 of one and the half a dozen of another are like complementary expressions they can exchange for each other. Now this principle is universal. It's not only there in Chinese philosophy 5,000 years ago, but it's here in 1994 mathematics. It's here in logic. And only 2 terms in the whole realm of mathematical expressions are perfectly interchangeable with each other and maintain the logical rigor and consistency of the same wholeness. Those 2 terms are 0 and infinity. Any place, any logical or mathematical expression that you have 0, you can substitute infinity, and the process, the expressive process, the methodological rigor will hold. Now this is a very peculiar thing. And it is rather mysterious the more you think about it, and so it isn't thought about so much. But one thing that comes out of this is the appreciation that complete equanimity, perfect complementarity, is at once the most common thing in the universe and at the same time the rarest thing in the universe. Put in emotional terms, a personality that is completely balanced is the rarest thing in the universe. But a completely balanced energy is the most distinguishing part of the universe. It's the most common. In a way, I have to make a little bit of a leap here with the metaphor. Forgive me for making this kind of dog-leg jump. In a way, you can say that the perfectly balanced human being is like the state of 0. It's very rare to achieve the state of 0. And human balance is that rare. The universe having balance is as common as infinity. And in a way, the zero and the infinity, which are complements in logic and mathematics, are also complements in terms of ourself and the universe. Were we to be able to attain to our zero base equanimity within, we would be exchangeable perfectly with the cosmos as an infinite whole. Now, this is a very easy thing to hear. It's very difficult to believe, and it is very puzzling to try and think about. It's as simple as this. When a human being experiences a kind of a quieting down, a settling down, to the point to where you're really just completely balanced, we blank out of this world. We go into sort of like a drift reverie state. One of the most conspicuous examples of this is in the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a kind of a feisty, torrential guy. He was always after women, he was after writing, he was after doing all sorts of things, and that's why he wrote his Confessions, what a bad boy I was. A bad French boy is really bad. And one time he was out on Lake Geneva, and he was rowing in a boat, and it was early in the morning. He was trying to get rid of a lot of anger, and he quit rowing, and he just sat there in his boat. He was exhausted. And for some reason, the meteorological event was perfect. The satin smooth quality of Lake Geneva, the mist sort of blanking out the mountain ranges around, and Rousseau, forgetting about all of his feistiness and anguish, calmed down. And he says in his Confessions, the most remarkable thing happened to me. I calmed down so much that I ceased to exist as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I was just at one with Lake Geneva in the early morning mist. That there was no way later, he thought about it, there was no way that he was not just a part of that lake. He criticized himself, he went back over it, he was philosophic, he was a sharp fellow. I mean, his Social Contract is still read as one of the most pristine examples of how to think straight politically. He says in his Confessions, there is no way that I was not a part of Lake Geneva for a little while. I was not who I was. I was whatever that reality was. He joined the cosmos in the form of the super calm, satiny Lake Geneva in the early morning mist. This is an example that when we attain to our equanimity is not a unity of one, but it is a zero base. That's the principle of modern science. That's the principle of ancient wisdom. The same principle. That principle allows for, because it has a zeroness which has great affinity with infinity. The word affine comes from chemistry. Two atoms that love to be together are affine. Like if you take an atom of chlorine and you take an atom of sodium, they get together in such a way that they kiss forever and they become a molecule of salt, sodium chloride. So a grain of salt actually is one of the universal examples of the way in which a pair occur together, and pairedness is a special case of complementarity. Pairedness is the polarized case of complementarity. And the reason why an atom of sodium and an atom of chlorine can kiss forever and become a grain of salt is because when complementarity which deals with like a spherical wholeness, when complementarity shifts from the perfect balance of equanimity or the perfect balance of verticality. It can go either way. You can be perfectly balanced in a horizontal way like Rousseau was, or you can be perfectly balanced in a vertical way like Buddha or somebody like that. This is an emotional quietness. This is a conscious quietness. And you can see that the two together form an esoteric wholeness. This is why the sign of the cross is not just a Christian sign, but the sign of the cross is the double equanimity that occurs. If you have a vertical equanimity and you rotate it 45 degrees to a diagonal, instead of the complementariness happening, it transforms and polarity happens. The same thing with a balance of equanimity in a horizontal. If you take a horizontal and it also is rotated 45 degrees, you get a polarity. So that complementarity happens as the most special as well as the most universal case. Whenever one achieves the exactness of the special case, there is complementarity, the complementarity of zero. Whenever one just lets the universe be whatever it's going to be, whatever it really is, then you have that case of infinity. The universe as a whole is complementarity, and the person in our deepest equanimity is also. And the deepest person and the universe are an ultimate complementarity. They're exchangeable one for the other. One could say just as easily that one becomes a cosmic person or a personal cosmos. Either statement, either way, have exactly the same significance and hold up logically valid and sound, and to bring in Leibniz's criterion, necessarily sufficient. All of these. What we found in looking at nature is that complementarity, which rotates slightly to one side or the other, drops out of complementarity and drops into a mode called polarity. And in polarity, there's always a preference. In complementarity, there's no preference because there's like an equality, not the equality of identity, something deeper than that. What's deeper than the equality of identity? The quality of secret exchangeability. But when the mode of complementarity shifts to the mode of polarity, there's always a preference. And in nature, the preference turns out to be that there's a tendency to go further in one direction or another. It's called left-handed or right-handed. It's called spin. It's also called chiral movement. So that one could have, for instance, lecture notes on physics, published in Berlin, when was this published? 1989. This is 1989 physics. It's entitled Time Harmonic Electromagnetic Fields in Chiral Media. Time harmonic electromagnetic fields in chiral media. And when you turn to the very first introduction, it reads like this. At the beginning of the last century, the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, the phenomenon of optical activity in certain biological and mineral substances was discovered independently by several people. Optical activity in certain minerals or in certain biological substances. What is the optical activity? They seem to generate patterns. When you looked at them, they seem to have this kind of flame-like quality of patterning going on. It's like somebody with a polka dot shirt on a television camera, and it seems that the shirt is vibrating, right? The shirt is not vibrating. It's the optical activity that's showing a chiral disposition. And it can either go left or right. All right? This became known in the early 1800s because it was a time when human beings, mostly men, mostly French men, started looking at things to see what they were. We don't have to go into it, but the impetus came from actually an English man, a friend of Benjamin Franklin, named Joseph Priestley, who was the first one to isolate an element. Oxygen was the first element isolated by Joseph Priestley, and it became immediately apparent to everyone who could think well that there are fundamental things that really do exist in nature, and they're called elements. And what other elements are there? And so they would look at things like minerals and so forth to try and tell, well, what is it made of? What elements is it made of? And it wasn't until the middle of the 1800s that enough of the elements had been found that people who were looking at the chart of all the elements that were found began to notice that there were certain characteristic families of elements, that elements belong in families, that they don't just occur as a Socratic mob, each one in an anarchy state, but that all of the elements in this world, and it turns out all the elements anywhere in the universe, the same elements, all belong in families that display certain characteristic structures, certain characteristic aspects. This monograph, 1989, Time Harmonic Electromagnetic Fields in Chiral Media, says, looking at these minerals, looking at these biological, there were some biological mixtures that, if you put together certain hydrocarbons in a kind of a neutral mixture, you'll get a swirling Brownian movement. If I take this cup and I pour a little bit of gasoline in this cup, I will get a motion of the gasoline seething around in the coffee. It's a chiral activity. It is a universal property of elements brought together in juxtaposition, where their electromagnetic energy qualities are distributing themselves in such a way that the matter moves with it. Just like if you have a bunch of iron filings and you put a magnet there, the little filings will arrange themselves along magnetic lines. In some minerals and some biological things, matter arranged itself along electromagnetic lines of distributed energy, largely because on the molecular level there was a dispensation of the same materials to move in the same way, left-handed or right-handed. It's very, very curious. So they write, condensed matter theories were still in embryonic stages at that time. No one knew how to explain this. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1980s that it was really understood to mathematical perfection. That's why this monograph. Because by 1989, just 5 years ago, it was finally understood that specifically, this is exactly why this happens, and it was like a revelation. You don't see many magazine articles on this because this is like 21st century stuff. One of the qualities that came out of this work was the realization, the specific attribute of chirality, of the fact that the universe is left-handed or right-handed, on the molecular level of things that belong together, they generate geometric patterns. The specific attribute of chirality is geometry. Understanding gleaned from studying molecular structure can be transmitted into the design and the manufacture of chiral media. In other words, there is a deep link between geometric design and the experience of chirality, which is the polarized nature of matter in its unitary phase. The very first masks, and the monograph, this is a physics monograph, has a frontispiece of a Maori mask. And this Maori mask displays the universal chirality. Now, the people that made this mask knew nothing about modern math or modern physics. They didn't even know the quality of investigation, perhaps, that Louis Pasteur had, who was one of the first people to really theorize that we were dealing here with some universal structure which was important for man to really understand. The geometricity of the mask is not some kind of primitive projection from a personality that is immature. That's what a lot of the anthropological textbooks will tell you. When man is stupid and primitive and he doesn't understand the universe, well, then he makes masks and he dances with those, and when he knows better, he doesn't do that anymore. Well, now you have to revise that, because in the 21st century, real good mathematicians and physicists are going to start making masks again, because this happens to be the real truth of the matter, is that primitive man was not primitive, he was primordial. And his experience of the process of integration was so ace perfect that he got to the zero base real quick all the time. And because he got to the zero base real quick all the time, he felt at one with the cosmos a lot. Not out of naivete, but out of really getting it. And if you were to put phosphorescent paint on the feet of dancers, say like Australian Bushmen, or say some tribe from Arnhem Land up in the Northwest Territories of Australia, and you were to keep track of the dance steps during one of their deep ceremonies, the overall geometricity, the matrix of all of the dance steps, all of the phosphorescent footprints left, would produce a pattern of chirality on the surface in which they danced. So that the mask and the dance were complementary expressions of this deep atonement at one-ment. The mask being one's personal integration, the dance being one's cosmic differentiation. One dances to express out and to give thanks. One makes a mask to integrate, to condense, and bring it here. So that the mask and the dance go together. And there's nothing primitive about that. There's something primordial about its complementarity. How does it get misunderstood? It gets misunderstood because people who are not in the tribe, who are not in that experience, who have never made masks, who have never danced with their people, had no idea of what this meant. one of the great statements made in 1967 in Canada by a Canadian Indian, Chief Dan George, who gave a wonderful speech before the Canadian Parliament. They were celebrating 100 years of Canadian Confederation. They were saying how good it was that we've now got 100 years under our belt. And Chief Dan George went to Ottawa and he said, I'm glad that you're having a celebration, a good time. I wish you to have a good day. But we do not celebrate here the centenary. Our people have been here for 50,000 years. And that to us, you have a long way to go to understand where it is that you live. And for myself, I find it hard to be deep friends with men who do not dance. There's a wonderful, elegant, non-angered statement. Chief Dan George was really somebody. If you do not dance, if you do not make masks, don't throw stones and call people primitive. That's why we're going to make masks and we're going to have ceremonies. We don't have too much of a dancing area, but our ceremonial movement will be a bona fide version of that. The whole purpose of the mask making, and we make 2 masks, is to display for ourselves how polarized actuality really does occur, and how by shifting it in a certain angle, it's like a diagonal, a 45-degree angle, by shifting the polarity 45 degrees, we slip into a complementarity. But the movement to complementarity from a polarized state is ambidextrous. It can go either way. You can go completely vertical or completely horizontal. You can go towards inner equanimity, or you can go towards differential universality. Now, this is extremely delicate. Almost anyone in the last 200 or 300 years who has written on this, and there are actually quite a few people who have written on this, have skirted the issue in such a way that they have not understood the delicate quality of truthfulness in the words that I'm sharing with you. Because complementarity can also shift either way, left or right, and go into the mode of polarity. So that real things like this exist in the diagonals of the world, and real things like the soul and the universe exist in the verticals and horizontals of the world. Both occur together, but the things of this world occur in the diagonal motions, and the things of the spirit and the cosmos exist in those more perpendicular horizontal modes. So that if you take an overall geometric view of this, literally you can say that the world of polarized matter is like an X. It has 4 points, it's like an X. And the world of the spiritual universe is like a cross, a St. Andrew's cross. If you put the cross, the St. Andrew's cross, and the X together, you get a radial 8-point quality. And that always has been called some version of a phrase meaning truthfulness. The Buddha called that the Dharma chakra, and the Hermetic tradition called it the Ogdode, whatever you want to call it, the eight quality. That double fourness is the wholeness of inner and outer together in direct pairedness with the wholeness of the polarized world. The principle to mark as a corollary to this is that none of these elements in either the cross or the X occur in any kind of isolated identity. There is no isolated identity. We would call that an alienated fragment. And there are, of course, alienated fragments everywhere, but they rearrange themselves according to universal order as soon as there's an energy field brought in. As soon as you bring a magnet in to all the little iron filings, they arrange themselves along magnetic lines. No one has to coerce them, no one has to threaten them, no one has to bribe them. They just do it because that's universal law. The same thing with alienation among people. As soon as a truthful order energy is brought into play, they order themselves. You don't have to twist anybody's arm. It happens universally on principle because that's the way the structure of reality is. But there are two distinct energy orders that are brought into play. One is a polarizing energy order, the world of things. And the other is a complementarity energy order, and that's the world of the spirit. Either way. And we belong in both realms simultaneously. We can belong in both realms simultaneously. To say that these realms are at war with each other is the height of projecting an alien fragment's opinion upon that standard. The word, the ancient Greek word for someone who was in that condition was someone who was acting according to doxa, opinion. And they will tell you, well, that's my opinion and I have a right to have it. The I there is very precarious. Because the I, we usually write in a beautiful graphic way. We write a line, vertical, with a line cutting it off at the bottom and a line cutting it off at the top. Capital I. And a capital I is the monogram of the ego. And it has its opinion. And God damn it, its opinion counts. Plato's whole philosophical program was to take any opinion, no matter what it was, and to show that it has equally pros and cons. It has chirality in terms of modifications. And Socrates again and again would take anyone who had a definite opinion about something and establish what it was, and to progressively through a method of conversation that shifted from polarity to complementarity, very slowly shifted, that one could actually demonstrate that anyone will modify their own opinion increasingly as they are exposed to the energy, the coherent energy of complementation. And the same way that someone who has an opinion, a spiritual opinion, there's a lot of spiritual opinions, that you can apply the same process by shifting them from their complementarity opinion to a modified polarized position, so that both sides learn in the same way. And that a real education, I mean not just instruction, not just, business school stuff, but a real universal education will rotate us through the entire circle of learning the entire sphere of all of the modes of polarity and complementarity, so that after a while we get used to the fact that there is this whole field that is available to us. Where Plato's dialogues focused on an angle of vision, of shifting somebody from one position to the other, or from the other to the one. And all of the Platonic dialogues develop the awareness that this angle of where it was that we started, vis-a-vis where it is that we are now, that those two lines meeting together form an angle of vision. And that the insight which goes down that angle of vision to the point to where those two lines come together was called the thesis. The thesis was the perspective that enabled us to look down the angle of vision to where the two lines met. Where the doxa, the opinion, that opinion line met the other line, the line of aletheia, of truth. And opinion and truth meet at a common juncture. And that common juncture is where the person who held that opinion, who is the same person who realizes the truth. So that the thesis, looking down the angle of vision, which is established by showing anybody that these two lines converge in them, recognizes that they inhabit the place where those two lines both come together. And there's a moment, as Socrates says, of embarrassed humility and then wonderful joyousness. That you held that dogged opinion, but you are the same person who had that realization that there was a better way. It's called the paradox of the fortunate fall. Let's fall into the kitchen and have some goods. All right, let's see what we can do with this. Let's see where this goes. Let's ask the question, what are we doing? We're in a complementarity. It's not just that you're listening and I'm talking. It's not a simple thing like that. There's an active listening. There's a very active listening. The active listening is called in English apprehension. Apprehension. Prehensile is like being able to grasp with your hand. Apprehension is being able to grasp with your attention. When you grasp with your attention, it's like the inner hand is able to then feel if it's real. Most people's physical hand is not very highly developed. A blind person can tell right away what something is, if that's chintz or not. But our inner hand has never been compromised, and it can tell right away when something is true or not. So an education that's really worthwhile allows for its values, its meaning, to penetrate down to your inner hand, your sense of apprehension. That is called, and believe me, it was called, the entrance to the sublime. Scout's truth, Buddhist Scout's truth. Two essays by Friedrich von Schiller, who used to wear his collar up and capes and great stars and really carry it off. On the sublime. On the sublime. It's in a little book in the series called Milestones of Thought. They used to do things like this in the United States in the 50s and 60s when people still really liked this sort of thing. Schiller, who was Goethe's closest intellectual peer and friend, the one who wrote the poem Ode to Freedom that Beethoven set the Ninth Symphony to. Schiller wrote, "The sublime object is of a dual sort. We refer it either to our power of apprehension and are defeated in the attempt to form an image of its concept, or we refer it to our vital power and view it as a power against which our own dwindles to nothing." Now you can hear from what I said earlier this morning that behind Schiller's thought is a real good recognition of the zero and the infinite. Smart guy. A+. And one of the things of this education is you get exposed to several thousand A+ people that form the cream of the heritage of this planet. And if you're going to be a planetary person, you can't just be planting evergreen trees all over the planet. You have to understand that there's a heritage, a very high heritage here, and Schiller is one of them. The sublime object is of a dual sort. Notice that when we want to say two in terms of duality, that our fingers in making the two make a V, they make an angle of vision. The human hand itself, on a universal level, cannot lie. That's why sacred mudras were put in forms of the hand. That's why the hands shake. That's why the healing of laying on of hands. All of that. Hands do not lie. In one of his sublime moments, in his television series on the ascent of man, the great mathematician, scientist, Jacob Bronowski said, "The hand is the cutting edge of the mind." Because man learns that whatever his hand can do, his mind begins to expand to encompass the increased facility that he has used. And when man, in an early phase, 5 million years ago, when the forerunners of man, when the hominids first learned to walk bipedally, freeing the hands, it freed a quality of apprehension that was never there before. And it's naive just simply to say that somebody who's on 4 legs, on their hands and their feet, is only about 2 feet off the ground, and when you stand up you're about 5 or 6 feet off the ground, that you can see further. That's a simplistic misunderstanding. It's true that if you're on all fours, you can see about 1.5 miles, and if you stand up, you can see maybe 5, 6, 7 miles, sometimes even 20 miles. But the inner apprehension sees in terms of a heritage that could span thousands of years and see to the moon and the sun, because as soon as a creature stands up, they're no longer looking at the sod trying to dig out worms, but they're looking at a horizon of the earth, and eventually they notice that above this horizon are stars and sun and moon and all kinds of things. They begin to have a spherical dimension. As Wallace Stevens once said, the amplitude of theatricality comes into play. And the creature begins to have an inner quality called a soul, or at least the potential for a soul, because they have an apprehension quality. Schiller says, he writes, "The sublime object is of a dual sort." And here's the duality. As long as we're in this world of polarity, it's a duality. But if we shift this world 45 degrees, and I'm going to show you step by step how that's done, we move into a realm of complementarity. What is the duality? The sublime object is of a dual sort. We refer it, that sublime object, we refer it either to our power of apprehension, our inner apprehension, and when we do so, we are defeated in the attempt to form an image of its concept. Apprehension does not have images. What does apprehension have? It has gestalts that tend to function more and more as they become familiar to us. The gestalts tend to become ideas. The inner forms of apprehension are gestalts that tend by familiarity to become ideas. Ideas are not just inner images. They're a whole order. They're an integral order. It's like raising something to a higher power. Images are wonderful, but the image horizon is like the surface of the earth. It clings pretty much to the surface of the earth, or whatever planet you're on. Images, in a way, are representations. But the inner apprehension of gestalts that tend to become ideas are able to look up from the surface of the earth into the spaces that include other worlds, stars, sun, moon, so that ideas are a higher order, literally, figuratively, actually, a higher order. And something on a higher order is able to integrate things on a lower order to a much greater extent. You can integrate a collection of images by a very powerful image, but it has its limitations and it can only go so far. It's like, how much math can you do counting on your fingers? It's like that. Yes, you can do it, but it doesn't go very far. As soon as you jump to a higher power, as soon as you use ideas to order images, you can order trillions of images very succinctly. And an idea is so much more powerful than images, they don't even exist in a competitive arena. And there are levels of integration that integrate ideas. You could integrate trillions of ideas like that. It's called realization. So there are whole capacities that this education is seeking, at least it's like a guide showing you the largest landscape that there is of learning. That's what this education is. This is the Universal Studios tour. Huh? Or the Japanese say, ne, ne. The Universal Studios tour of the whole realm of what there is to know and how you can know. Real education. You can go anywhere with it. Schiller says that there are two: the inner power of apprehension, where we are defeated in an attempt to form an image of its concept, or the other one, we refer it to our vital power, our physical life energy, and view it as a power against which our own dwindles to nothing. Apprehension, the inner sense, is the realm of symbols and of essences. The vital power is a realm of ritual and of existence. So these are two realms, they're related to each other. Why do we bring in the sublime? We bring in the sublime here because this idea was constellated at a time when there was a reformulation, a struggle to put together a new way of experiencing and looking at what is happening to us, the world that we're in. It comes from around 1800. It has just a broad date. 1800. Curiously enough, it's the time when Jefferson remade the United States. The Revolution of 1800 was easily as great as the Revolutionary War. It recut the United States into what we would recognize as America. The same thing happened in terms of experience in general, in broad, in Western civilization. Rousseau was rowing his boat about that time, a little bit before that time. Schiller was writing about that time. It's the culmination of the 1700s. And the reason why there was that culmination in the 1700s is that at the culmination of the 1600s, there was an epochal change, like a trigger, and the outcome of the results of pulling that trigger in the 1680s resulted in the 1780s being a time of tremendous creative upheaval, 1780s, 1790s. Tremendous upheaval, which were consolidated around 1800, brought together. What was the trigger that was pulled in the 1680s? The trigger that was pulled then was a monumental book by Sir Isaac Newton called the Principia. I've got 5 or 6 translations and editions. Translations because it was written in Latin. Its first Latin edition was 1686. And the big revision of it came in 1712, 1713, around that time. Newton, by that time, had another quarter of a century of experience with his own ideas, and he really honed it in. And the second edition of the Principia, around 1713, is an extraordinary book. It remade completely our understanding of mathematics. And it was translated into English in 1729. So that the University of California Press did this beautiful edition of Sir Isaac Newton's Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy and His System of the World. So we're talking about nature. And because we're talking about nature in a deep way, we're talking about nature having a structure. And that the structure of nature doesn't just stay in some frozen way, isn't just statically some frozen thing, but that the structure of nature exhibits all the time change. The structure of nature is that it changes all the time, and that the changes go through an ecology, a cycle of phases. And that those phases can be identified specifically to any degree of exactness. You tell us what degree of exactness you want, and it will be provided. The exactness of the atomic angles of DNA are 10 to the 10,000th power. That's 10 with 10,000 zeros. There is no mistake whatsoever. Life is not dice. The probability that's there is not due to lack of specificity. It's called, in mathematical analysis, the principle of invariance, which is extremely powerful. When you're using mathematical analysis for structural determination, the principle of invariance is very powerful. It is always paired with the calculus of probabilities. the way in which shifts and changes and transformations happen, so that the specific exactness is always in a complementary relationship with the constant flux, the change, the transformation, so that one needs a kind of a language structure that allows you to ambidextrously be specifically exact to the 10,000th power of something, and at the same time to take in the phases of change. So you need a transformational grammar, as they say now, using linguistic theory, Noam Chomsky. You need some kind of a language, the structure of which language allows you to speak both this way and that way within the same coherent language. The first language ever developed on this planet to do so was in the I Ching by the Chinese 5,000 years ago. It's the first language that takes the binary polarity, which gives the specific quality. I'm trying to say two words at the same time. Specificity and specific. It is only through polarity that one achieves specific exactness. The specs on anything are due to the functioning of the polarized nature, the polarized version of it. The apprehensive wholeness of it is not on that spec sheet. It's nowhere to be found in that spec sheet because it exists in a different energy mode, knit in with it, but in the background. But in such a way that when you focus on that background and it comes as a form, the apprehensive form of its changes, the specificity drops into the background. The polarity is still there, but it becomes part of the background. The I Ching showed that in a polarized world, everything that we see, and notice, listen to the adjective, sight, see, everything that we see in a polarized world is calibrated around a specific functioning. What is that functioning? The functioning of an energy, an electromagnetic energy, which indexes, like a fulcrum, the very center of our calibration in terms of polarity. Well, what's the guy talking about? It sounds like double talk. I'm talking about light, talking about optics. Whenever we want to talk about the polarized world in such a way as being really specific and getting down to brass tacks, to the real fine figures, we talk about the physics of light, the physics of optics. And Newton's optics, which came out in 1704, did for physics what his Principia did for mathematics. His Principia for mathematics gave us a way of apprehending constant changes. He didn't call them changes, he called them fluxions. So that Newton's Principia is the inner world of apprehending the gestalts, integrated powerfully enough so that they became ideas. And his optics dealt with the polarized world, so that these two books together deal with the two possibilities of Schiller. That's why Schiller could write 100 years later very confidently that the really sublime, like the universe, has these two qualities. The dust is appalling on these unread books. Don't trust your teacher. Go and read them yourself. I could be wrong. Newton's Principia and Newton's optics are two lines of development. One of them is the line of the world of opinion, and the other is the line of the world of aletheia. And the angle of vision that was made by these two books, by the time the optics came out and people finally paired them together and got what he was saying, it blew hell out of poetic theory. The best study ever done of what happened to this is called The Breaking of the Circle by a woman. Sometimes it takes a woman to see what it was that these guys really did. The kind of poetry you had before this angle of vision was available was poetry like Alexander Pope or John Dryden or John Milton, worrying about angels falling out of heaven and getting singed. The kind of poetry that came after this was William Blake and William Wordsworth, Percy Shelley. The difference between Alexander Pope and William Blake is that Sir Isaac Newton's angle of vision took hold. And notice, we're talking about an English language realm of apprehension. By the time Newton got translated as he was, into German, into French, into every language that you can think of, the same kind of change happened in those places also. The only person who could think well enough to understand what Newton was really doing exactly at the time, and probably understood it better than Newton himself, was Leibniz. And you get a fantastic change. A fantastic change. Before Leibniz, German philosophy was all rooted in writing theological commentaries on books of the Bible, especially the New Testament. After Leibniz, you get the kind of thought that culminates in people like Schopenhauer. So that this angle of vision, notice that mathematics and physics for the last 300 years have gone together as an angle of vision. The principles of mathematics and the principles of physics linked together in an angle of vision have been the fulcrum by which the Western world just pole vaulted over a whole realm of resistances that no other civilization ever was able to deal with adequately. The transformational grammar that Newton used to bridge these two worlds was calculus. The language of calculus. The mathematical language, the universal language of calculus. Because it can deal with the infinitely small and the infinitely large ambidextrously. You can have integral equations and you can have differential equations. You can have partial differential equations. You can have all kinds of variants. But what they tend to do is that they are expressions of inter-apprehensive gestalts tending towards very clear ideas of quantities and of energies, of functions that tend to vary between 0 and 1. The oneness of the infinite all and the 0 of the infinitesimally disappearing nada. So that the infinite and the 0 make an angle of vision, much like Newton's Principia and optics. But for the Chinese, their 0 was Tao, in the I Ching 5,000 years ago. Their Principia was Tao. Nah. What was their optics? Their optics was what we would call, what the Chinese, they had a phrase for it, and in English it's translated as the 10,000 things. To the Chinese, when you counted up to 10,000, that was enough of that. We're not going to count anymore. It means a lot. It means the world of multiplicity. The Italians call it lazza. And when there's lazza, don't take a fork to it. In between Tao and the world of 10,000 things, there were 5 phases. It's called the energy cycle, the 5-phase energy cycle. And what that energy cycle is, are the 5 phases of moving from a 0 to a 45-degree diagonal. Each angle of 45 degrees has 5 phases of movement, where you go from 0 to multiplicity. And then, because it's still happening, you can go from multiplicity all the way back to 0 in another 5 phases. And then you can keep going like that, so that there's a cycle, an energy cycle. It's the same thing as what Newton was talking about in his Principia and his optics, only the Chinese were talking about it in terms of the energy movement of change. The 5-phase energy cycle is this. Tao was the first, and it's 0-based. It has no numerical value. It has a 0 base. The second is Te, and Te is the realm of polarity, where unity happens, not duality. You have to put a little nick, and you have to check yourself. You have to put Scotch tape over your mouth every time. Polarity does not mean duality. It means unity. How can you say that? Because when you express that kind of duality, you've got an angle of vision. It's the angle of vision that is the unity. The oomph in the Te is because you can do something with that. You can apply that angle of vision. William Blake has one of the most beautiful expressions of that angle of vision, where he has God the Creator holding these calipers of light, and he's drawing the circle of the world with them. Once you have an angle of vision, once you have that kind of unity, you have a tool which you can make worlds out of. That's why it's called Te. And that's why Lao Tzu's book is called Tao Te Ching. Ching just means book. It's the book of Tao Te. It's the book of how Tao moves to Te. Because once you understand how Tao moved to Te, then you're ready to hear real good how Te moves to the next phase. And what's the next phase? Gen. Gen. Usually means human-heartedness. It means us. We're in the 3rd phase of a 5-phase energy cycle. The Chinese say, 5,000 years ago and right up to today, the way I learned it was to sit there and just hear the phrase. The phrase in English runs like this: man is the bridge between heaven and earth. It's as simple as that. That somehow heaven is at the 0 base beginning, and earth is at the 5th phase end of that whole cycle. And that man is in the 3rd phase in between. Man is the bridge between heaven and earth. So heaven is the 1st phase, Te, unity is the 2nd phase, man is the 3rd phase, earth is the 5th phase. All that's left then is to determine what the fourth phase is. What's between man and earth? And between man and earth, the Chinese, the I Ching calls that I. I. We would translate that as symbols. Apprehensive gestalts tightened into things in the mind, ideas, symbols. Primordially, one doesn't have ideas in the mind. That's actually, technically, should be something we reserve for the differential mode. Ideas are in the differential energy, not in the integral energy. It's a little nicety. You might as well hear it now. There are symbols in integration, but no ideas. To have an idea means you have to open the symbol up. You have to open it up and find out what it means. Then you get the idea. And as someone said, I forget who it was now, it wasn't Karl Marx, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. It doesn't matter what resistances there are, because those resistances happen on the ritual level, and an idea comes into play on a whole other energy. It just radiates through like cosmic rays. The power of an idea is not obviated by natural resistances at all. It's like in Desert Storm, all those World War I trench tactics, and Schwarzkopf's military planning just simply ignored them. On the principle that they have a very nice balloon, all you have to do is puncture it in one place and the whole thing will collapse. Because West Point military training for a long time has incorporated a lot of Tao, Shunzi, the art of warfare, the art of understanding. The power of an apprehensive gestalt tightened to a symbol and then opened up to an idea, especially a powerful strategic idea, can move right through all the resistances that on a ritual level are erected. Not they so much as ignorance, has no defense against wisdom. And that's the hell of it for the devil. He has no defense whatsoever against the wise human being. It's like, what was that movie, Starman, with Jeff Bridges? The person who's not limited by this world can walk through the torrential fires of a car crash in this world as if it just doesn't faze you. The demons spread the word that this is a miracle, it's something unusual and odd, and they don't want you to know that it's something that all of us can do at any time we mature. That's the beauty of it for us, that's the hell of it for them, because they're out of work. And there are no bread lines for out of work demons. So that the 5-phase energy cycle runs like this. Tao, Te, Zhen, Yi, Li. The 5th phase, the earth phase, in Chinese is called Li. Li actually means, in later Chinese thought, principle. The earliest use of Li meant right, R-I-T-E, right. In other words, in later Chinese thought, the word, the character, Li, became principle, a principle upon which something would happen. But its original use was that it was a ritual disposition that was codified exactly. So that there is, in the Confucian classics, a book called the Li Qing, the Li Qi, the Book of Rites. I have a translation here in 2 big volumes. One of the Confucian classics, the Book of Rites. It was written by Confucius about a generation or two after the Tao Te Ching. And it was written at the time when Confucius was writing his commentaries on the I Ching. His commentaries on the I Ching, they're called wings. And he wrote a series of commentaries because he was pretty smart. Confucius realized that the I Ching needed to have some kind of approach, phase, acquaintance, process, because very few people could understand what was going on here. It's not as if all Chinese understand this. Most Chinese throughout all history have never understood this in the sense that they could tell you about this. This was reserved for a special elite called the literati. The Chinese civil service was instituted around 220 BC, and the very first book that you studied was the I Ching, and after you went through all the other Confucian classics, there were 5 of them, you came back to the I Ching for one last shot to see how you could do now. You read the Book of Rites, you read the Book of History, you read the Book of Poetry, and you came back and you read again the I Ching. Confucius' commentary on the I Ching was written about the same time as the Book of Rites.
Okay, good.
We're blowing out the machines. Let me just show you something. The symbol for the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, the Tai Chi symbol is put on the family crest of the great Danish physicist Niels Bohr. He put it on his family crest because he understood that his principle of complementarity in modern quantum physics was exactly that of the I Ching symbolized by this Tai Chi symbol. And Bohr put that on his family crest many, many decades before the Tao of Physics was written by Jean-Jacques Capra. Because Bohr was the first person, since Leibniz, some 300 years before him, to really understand that what happens in the I Ching is that you take a polarity structure, which can be expressed in terms of a simple binary, 0 and 1, but that you can distribute the binary terms of 0 and 1 to an infinite extent so that you can have expressions that will express with just 0 and 1 the exact detail that's necessary for very sophisticated gestalts to form apprehensively within so that one has very clear ideas of what you have said. All right. What does it mean in street talk? That you can take an image of something and transmit it by a binary code and reconstruct by playing out that binary code through a computer system, and you can have a very refined photograph of a moon of Neptune some 3 billion miles away, so that you can see that there are volcanoes with black gas erupting at 457 degrees below Fahrenheit, and that you get volcanic action, almost like geotechnic mazing action, at temperatures where you thought everything was going to be not only frozen stiff but deathly still, that the universe is very much alive. It means that the world of polarity transforms easily into the world of wholeness, of complementarity, if you have the transformational grammar. And what this education provides is just simply the entire language course of all the transformational grammars that there exist. Not just on this planet, but on any star system, anywhere in this universe. This is the way they universally line up. It's the old principle. When you have the alignment right, then you can understand, even before it happens, you can predict what's going to occur. As soon as you have the trilithon and the heel stone at Stonehenge, you know that on June 20th, the sun is going to rise at that spot over Salisbury Plain. And you can gather all your superstitious family and friends and tell them that the sun is going to rise there, and you can show them that it does. They'll think that it's magic, but you will know that it deals with participating in the reality of the cosmos. And the only way you can get that alignment is to have aligned your zero integration with the infinite of the universe in the first place. That's the only way it ever occurs to you to put that arch of trilithons and to put that heel stone where it is. And once you have that, you can plot everything. You can plot the way the moon will rise in the same spot after 56 years. Can you imagine that? It would take a whole normal lifetime, 56 years, to prove that that happens, and yet it does. And not only that, you can predict, Stonehenge already predicted 4,700 years ago, the rising of several stars, which is amazing. Because they did it without what we would call a real mathematical background and technique. All they had was the angle of vision which ancient Egyptians developed, the ability to find 2/3 of any number. And small like that is in the arsenal of analysis, just that hedge gave man 5,000 years ago. Stonehenge is built about the same time that the I Ching really comes into play. It gave man around the world, around this planet, at the very same time, enough of an angle that the myth of it was that there had been a flood of ignorance and that man had emerged out of the flood. There was a Chinese Noah. There was a Chaldean Noah. There was an Egyptian Noah. And they all happened at the same time. The same time that Stonehenge and the I Ching were built. Once man has an angle of vision, he gets the point that he can change from a misunderstanding to an understanding by following a certain phase, an initiatory phase, a transformation phase. We're going to study, starting in 2 weeks, the way in which initiations through ritual were the first guides to man. And next year we'll study how the conscious transformations were made in terms of art. Whoa, they say. How do they say it in the valley? Whoa. Atom has 4 valences. Did you know that? And the nitrogen molecule has 4. Did you know that? Did you know that organic things are all based on carbon? And the respiratory medium is oxygen placed inside of nitrogen. And oxygen has a double valence only, 2. And did you know that hydrogen has a single valence, and that when you put these 2 atoms together, if we can put another one of these, let me just show you something here. Water. H2O. Watson, when he was writing the double helix, said the most important thing the hedge that he had, the way he beat the old master Linus Pauling, is that he stole his thunder. He realized that the models do not have an infinite ambidextrousness. They must be a certain way to be right. And if you keep channeling all of your creativity back to the model to check you, the model will slowly resolve itself to what it must be. And Sherlock Holmes gave us the principle. No matter how improbable it is, when you have eliminated everything else, what remains has got to be true. And that's how DNA was found. By a precocious 25-year-old who simply eliminated everybody else's pet theories. Of course, he got those theories by stealing them, but then Hermes was always a thief. That's it.